but it seems to be integral to having a currently functioning society that we have cars at least available to a vast majority of people. However, if there were no benefits to having cars, right, and they only gave us deaths, you'd probably be okay with banning them.
Sure, but as I've as I point out, like I do acknowledge there are negative like outcomes when it comes to like car ownership. I think they're all benefit, but I think at this point in time, I think the benefits probably outweigh the negatives.
Hold up, Walt wants speed dragon. Here you go, my dude.
Hey, what's up, man?
What's up? Hey, how you doing?
I'm good, dude. So I just wanted to comment on this notion with like firearms accidents really quickly and all that. And I want to just kind of set the stage so you know I'm not just like talking out of my ass, okay?
Yep.
So on my end, U.S. Army veteran, 8 years, did a tour in Iraq. College educated. I'm finishing up my bachelor's now. Going to go on to post-grad soon. And as far as weapons training outside of that, I'm a licensed CCW holder in the most restrictive, or one of the most restrictive states in the union, which is California. So lots of firearm safety training with that. So I just really quickly on the firearms deaths that are happening because of accidents, it's actually incredibly low. We're seeing like maybe 400 a year in the United States, right? And the issue that I have isn't so much that you point to, say, reducing risk of accidents, because we could trivially agree, hey, like, let's talk about safety training, let's talk about gun locks, right, providing them, because even just providing those measures is helpful for reducing accidents on a strictly voluntary basis, even without regulation. It's actually incredibly helpful just to give people things like safe storage. We could trivially agree on things like domestic violence reform, right, in that if you're beating your wife, a gun in the household's not a good idea, right? So we can agree on a lot of common sense stuff, I think, like if we were to really go policy by policy and look into them empirically, right? Where I take an issue is this framing in particular around when you're looking for like justifiable homicides versus not. And I want to explain that problem a little bit more. Would you prefer that there's more justifiable homicides with firearms? It seems wrong, right, to suggest that. Like, we would want less people to die, right?
Wait. You seem to be implying. You seem to be implying that I want more justifiable homicides, and I think that would be a super uncharitable view of my words here.
Well, that's what I'm trying to suss out, right? So, like, if we all agree that we prefer less homicides,
but it's surely a reasonable charitable response would be that I probably don't, right? Like that would be a reasonable charitable response.
Sure, 100%. So my problem then is when we're framing this in terms of those like justifiable versus unjustifiable homicides, and then we have Bunk's argument over here, which is one I'm deeply sympathetic to, right? Which is like there's ultimately going to be these practical, real world considerations that you as an individual are going to have to make in America, right? And we couple that with the fact that guns have been around, concealed, openly carried, like they've been around us all this time. And when you look at
concealed carry, there is no empirical evidence that concealed carry is a net good. But go on.
Well, I mean, we could look at that. Like, if you're curious.
I literally have studies. I literally have 10 studies that will literally prove this. Okay. Like this is like the problem here, right? Is that like? Go on.
No, I was just gonna say like we could look at that demographic of concealed carrier, like the licensed concealed carrier, right? And they are one of the demographics that commits the least amount of crimes in the U.S., right?
Literally, unrestricted concealed carry and shelter concealed carry laws were associated with a 4.4% to 6.5% higher overall homicides per capita. So this is like the problem, right?
But okay, if I can interject real quick, okay?
Go ahead.
So, while I'm in agreement with Prag, at least on the idea that most evidence shows that concealed carry laws are probably going to increase crime, I think that there's a difference between prescriptions we're making for society versus like an individual, right? So, like, again, I referenced this take by Destiny that we were kind of in agreement on. That if, for example, you live in a large city and you can't afford rent, right, you probably should move out of that area. Now, if everybody did this, that would be unsustainable, right? Obviously, these cities do need a large pool of labor to draw from. But on an individual basis, I think that's a fine prescription to make, even if we're not drawing that out into an entire policy. That's what I'm trying to get at.
Okay, well, I would disagree with that on a philosophical level then. I think in terms of, because I believe that the state should have a monopoly on violence. I believe once citizenry decide that the state is being ineffective at taking the monopolization of violence, that they should then take those matters into their own hands in the form of self-defense. I believe that removes the ability. We are saying that the citizenry should be responsible for their safety instead of the state being responsible for their safety. And on a philosophical level, I would disagree with that.
Well, the problem is that you're making like the state should be responsible for people's safety. The problem is that it's not currently. All right?
Yeah, but
it's
I
not
believe
currently
that
sufficient enough in a lot of different areas that you can rely upon the state for your own safety. So I'm saying on an individual basis, there might be situations where you should take your safety into your own hands.
I disagree with that. I think you should always leave it, in most circumstances, I think you should leave it up to the institutions that are there to protect you.
So how do you plan then on working around things like the Supreme Court precedent, right? That's making it such in America that officers have no obligation to protect you, right? So like we have probably in the neighborhood of 600 million guns if you're willing to update the math from when the 400 million number came out, plus or minus sales, plus or minus the super spooky ghost guns, right? We have 600 million of them. We say, hey, look, these things are in circulation. Like, we're not getting rid of them, right? And we have this issue now of the police don't have to show up to protect you. Like, there's no legal obligation there for them to do that. That's backed by SCOTUS. And then now you're telling people, in a sense, like, hey, if someone breaks into your house at night while you're there, while your family's there, or you're walking down the street, someone pulls a weapon on you and says, give me your wallet, right? Like we have these things happen.
I have to stop you. I don't know enough about those legal precedents, I think, to talk about that at the moment.
Okay,
that's all I'm going to say.
Fair enough. I mean, and so like,
Can I ask you a question, Prag, real quick?
Sure.
Okay, let's say for like the sake of an argument, okay, I have a gun. I guarantee, I think I know, like, your answer. Maybe you go, like, completely off the deep end, you bite this bullet, but I don't think you will. So, let's say I have a gun, all right? Somebody is approaching me, and they're clearly showing deadly intent, okay? They're running at me, let's say, with a knife, okay? Should I go and shoot them, or should I allow the state to have a monopoly on force in that situation?
Well, no, you would have a right to self-defense in cases where someone is a direct threat to you.
Right. So if I were to purchase a gun, like, we would say that that's generally a good thing, right? That we are reducing harm by doing so, right? If we're going from, I believe we're both utilitarians to an extent.
No, because we would be anticipating events that have not yet happened.
Well, obviously, we're always anticipating events that have not happened, okay? Somebody might be charging at you with a knife. They might, like, just drop it on the fucking floor and walk away, Obviously, we're making predictions. This is pretty obvious.
But I don't think it probably is a good idea. It seems to be a mass level of paranoia to say that, well, I need to like do all this stuff because in the case that a person could like kill me, right?
Well,
like
the problem
it seems
is I would say this isn't a mass level of paranoia. If you're in a place with a lot of crime, I think it's pretty reasonable.
Crime doesn't mean murder, though. Okay, high crime, we have to differentiate these two
even make
things,
it high murder. There are places with a
Okay.
lot of murder in the U.S., okay?
Sure.
All right? I grew up in these kinds of areas, okay?
Mhm.
So, with that understanding in mind, I don't think it's paranoia to say that there's a large amount of this type of crime in this area. I ought to be prepped if I'm the target of one of those crimes. As an individual, I don't think that's absurd.
No, because as an individual, I think we have a moral obligation to some degree. Okay, let me try and reword this. As an individual, I think we have a moral obligation to think about the wider consequences of our actions. I think that's probably a moral obligation that we have.
Sure.
And so, if we have that moral obligation, I think the idea that we can just focus on the individual level without focusing on like how that action could negatively affect our communities, I think would be unethical.
Well,
Sure. I mean, I'm willing to grant that. I think that the issue is we have to really be about it if we're going to be about it, right? So like if you're going to go down the road of a consequentialist analysis, which I think has a place. I'm not a utilitarian, but I think it has a place, especially in policy. I think that we have to then look at like all of these things, all of these other potentialities, all of these situations that could occur. We have to, suss out probabilities and stuff. And we can level with the facts here. Like it is highly unlikely you'll ever have to defend yourself in your life with a gun, period, in the US. Like it's very unlikely.
That's true.
It's also, it's also one of those things where, when the situation does pop up, you'd rather have it, not need it, than need it and not have it, right? Like just at a practical level, like if something popped up. And we also have to address how the policies and everything interact. And I know you may be a little bit more fuzzy on that, but I want to just kind of walk through a couple of those issues with the policy currently. So like when I did my concealed carry class in California, right, my instructor kind of more or less laid out for me that as far as he's concerned, if you're pulling that gun, you're pulling the trigger, right? Because as a matter of California law, right, if you brandish a weapon and point it at someone, that's an assault with a deadly weapon, just period, right? So if you're doing that, it's already at that point where you're defending your life. Now, you may not need to pull the trigger, but if you kind of think about the incentivization there, right, you have an opportunity to make it one person's story instead of two people's story, right, to the cops when they show up, if they do. And you kind of think about that, and you think about stuff like the stand your ground laws, right, where maybe they're not encoded properly. Or you also think about the opposite side of that, like duty to retreat, right? We generally want to avoid violent situations, so a duty to retreat can make sense in law. But then you look at, okay, well now I'm kind of in these situations where I can't ever really defend myself because now at these points the policy has made it so difficult. And I think also in Missouri right now, for instance, there's a law coming out where if you're going to use the affirmative defense in court of self-defense, right? Just like Rittenhouse did, or so many other cases in the U.S., they're looking at making the police prove that it wasn't that before they can prosecute you. So they're calling it a get away with murder clause right now, right? So whenever we talk about the policy solutions here, that's an aspect of it. And the second thing I'll bring up, and then I'll let you guys kind of go at it. But the second thing I would bring up is a lot of the times where we look at these correlations between like, okay, there's more guns here, there's a higher gun violence rate. One trivially, of course, right? If there's more cars, there's more car accidents. Like this makes sense, right? It's common sense. But we can also
well, it's not only common sense; it's backed up by data.
Well, yeah.
No, like, in my opinion, right, we don't even need the data, right, for that point. It's trivial, it's obvious, right? So, but sure, right, there is data too. But when we go into other things, like we look at education, right, in like South Chicago, you raise kids' grades by a letter, right, 10%. Yep. And violent crime among those kids drops 20%. Or you look at food stamps, right, with suicides. You can curb suicides like 3,000 a year, roughly, by increasing who gets food stamps by one standard deviation for that study was 4.5%.
Yeah.
So 4.5% more people, So it's like we could do all of these like welfare programs and kind of leave a lot of the gun stuff alone.
No. That is actually not true. Okay, that is like, oh my goodness. Okay, no, this is not true, right? Both of these policies would have to be taken together in tandem. For example, Socialism Done Left, who's done a lot of research on this, has literally made this point several times that the only way this is going to work is if we have the legalization of drugs, if we have the increase in like in terms of like social safety net programs with a lot of the gun restriction policies. These things have to be taken together in tandem. So if you only do one, you're not going to have the result you want. And if you only do the other one, you're not going to have the result you want.
I agree. I think that we need to look at it holistically, right?
But you just wait. No, stop, because you just said that we could leave a lot of the gun restriction stuff alone. I completely disagree with that.
I think that we could, and I understand that you disagree with it, and this is the counterpoint for your disagreement, right? We can print our own guns now. It'll cost you about $300 to break into that, right? We're at a point where there's 600 million guns in the country. Most of them are owned by the quote unquote law-abiding citizen, whatever. Most of them aren't a problem, right? But if it were ever to be a gigantic problem, right? How do you go about getting them, right? How do you go about like, those levels of restrictions here, right? Because like at a functional level, I don't even know how many square miles in the US, right? But with all of those guns, like what are you going to do? Like we don't have the manpower, right?
So when it comes to 3D printing of guns, So this is pretty difficult. I haven't looked at this enough to like give you an answer on the 3D printing side of firearms. But I can effectively, right? Hold on. Yeah. I can effectively give you like some solutions, right, for this. A lot of it is going to be restricting sort of, I guess, like new purchases of guns, right? A lot of it is going to be like that. So one way that, for example, one thing that seems like it has some empirical evidence that would be good is like people who've committed like serious like crimes to enact like serious like crime gun relinquishment laws. So yeah, that has been something, and I think certain states like are starting to like consider that idea now, that probably if you've done a serious like violent crime, that you probably, if you own firearms, you should probably have those taken away with you. But a lot of the
we've had that for decades.
yeah. But a lot of states, as I'm sure you know, don't really enact those laws. They're not enforcing them. There's a lot of gun laws that are not actually being enforced at the moment as we speak. There's a lot
Sure.
of yeah. So I think like the increasing enforcement of that would have to be done. I definitely think when it comes to like pre-existing guns, that is obviously going to be difficult. I think the best we can do in those circumstances is to enact a mandatory background checks to a large degree, and sort of have a level of criteria of where we think people probably shouldn't be able to have those firearms. Now, again, not a gun abolitionist. At least in the short term, it does seem like in the short term that gun abolitionism is like a practical measure. So I'm not a gun abolitionist, but it does seem to me that in terms of like if you've committed a violent crime, for example, that you probably should have those guns taken away from you. And it seems that like a large portion of the American public seem to agree with my position on that.
Yeah.
So that would sort of be probably a side note. So effectively, if we're taking, that would sort of be my solution to that. When it comes to a lot of the new restrictions are going to be like in terms of like new gun ownership, obviously, because we of course want to sort of reduce the amount of gun ownership that happens in the future. And so that would, I guess, probably be my position on that. When it comes to 3D printing, I don't know enough about it. It seems that the first thing we have to do, it seems like 3D printing, there are several states, and I think even federally maybe, where 3D printing of guns, you don't even need a background check for those. So I definitely can see like your argument with that. I just don't know enough about it at this stage to really make prescriptions for that at the moment.
Yeah, and I mean, and just to invoke like the one thing from Kant, I think most people tend to agree with. I know, Bunk. I can't see your face right now because I'm not watching the stream, but I'm imagining the eyes roll when I bring up Kant. But the one thing from him, I think that's that's good, right? Is odd implies can, right? And so we have a contrapositive there, right? So like if we, the practicality element around 3D printing, right? I can tell you, like, I can personally attest to people I know that 3D print and don't give a damn about what the state has to say about it, right? And they will otherwise live law-abiding lives, just like someone who was smoking weed when it was illegal, right? They're otherwise going to be a good citizen. They just happen to smoke weed, and that just happens to be illegal, like a decade ago, right? And that's just kind of how it goes. Like and that's the big problem. Like if we can't get rid of them,
maybe.
then I think it's an issue.
Yeah. So I know, for example, in my country, they're also battling this, and an idea has been that sort of the blueprints, the blueprints for the 3D printing of firearms should probably be like heavily restricted. And I know that's an idea that my country, so I'm an Australian, and that's an idea that we have had, because like we are sort of like battling with this as well, and we're trying to like comes to like grips with this. I know, for example, the heavily restriction of the blueprints has like sort of been an idea. I mean, there are several like underground, I'm pretty sure now there are several like illegal manufacturer of guns, and I don't think we should just throw up our hands and say, well, there's a legal manufacturer of guns. I guess the only thing we have to just like support massive amounts of firearms in the community. I mean, for example, if people decide to like 3D print grenades, I wouldn't say, well, Grenades are in the community now. We should just throw up our hands and like say, oh well. I think we have to like sort of find ways to like sort of heavily restrict those practices happening and do the best of our ability to sort of restrict those. Doesn't mean all our measures are going to be successful. I don't know which measures are going to be the most successful. All I know is I'm not willing to say let's throw up our hands up in the air, because I think we could justify a lot of very dangerous laws with the idea that, well, it's impossible to regulate, so we shouldn't try.
Well, if it actually is impossible to regulate, I tend to agree with Walt on this. If
I
we
would
cannot come
disagree.
with a policy that
And so are
regulates
you okay?
something
Are you
at
okay with
all,
everybody owning grenades then? How about nuclear weapons? Like, this
I'm
is the problem, right?
pretty sure, all right, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm like, I don't know, like 90% sure, okay, that we can restrict people owning nuclear weapons, okay? Most
but
people,
what I'm saying is,
I'd say majority, vast majority even, I'd be willing to claim, vast majority of people don't own nuclear weapons. Would you agree
There's
with
a
me on that?
very small number
I
of
believe.
civilians that own them.
Wait. There are certain bad practices, right? That could be very widespread in the public that we might agree is unethical. For example, if there is a society, I'm going to be very bombastic here. If there's a society where pedophilia, okay, it's very
Yeah, last time a leftist used a pedophile example, it didn't go so well. Prag, chill out there.
So if pedophilia was very widespread in the community, I wouldn't say, well, it's extremely difficult to regulate this. We should throw up our hands in the air. I would completely disagree with that.
Difficult to regulate something does not mean that it's completely ineffective.
Okay. So I think even if it's super difficult, maybe I need to rephrase. I think if it's super difficult to regulate 3D printing of guns, I think we should still try. I don't think that everything that is difficult to regulate should be legal. I would absolutely disagree with like that prescriptive statement.
But I would agree with you on that. But what I said was, for example, let's say there's something that is so hard to regulate, like it's not even hard to regulate; it's impossible. Okay.
But what if that is having negative effects on public?
Well, what are we going to do about that if you can't do anything?
Well, I think you can still arrest people who probably engage in these practices, even if it's very widespread, right?
I mean, but also look at who you're doing that to, right? So this is like a culture of people that are like, you know, like 3%ers and like I'll come home on my shield or like with my shield or on it type like shit, right? Like so these are all people that are willing to die over this piece of. I get that, but if you're a consequentialist, right, then like you know your ethics here are going to be, in particular with utilitarianism, right? Especially if we're evaluating an act so specifically and with this amount of empirical data before making a decision, right?
No, my ethics would. I think you can be a consequentialist and still be an egoist. So
sure, egoism is a form of consequentialism. So I think
So like,
right?
I'm not a I would probably identify more with egoism than utilitarianism, but yeah, anyway.
I mean, fair enough.
My preferences would be that probably we should not be 3D printing guns. Right? So like
Okay, let's say no matter what policy you put in place, it did not prevent people from 3D printing guns, okay? Like no matter what you did. All right, there was no effect.
That's been demonstrated yet though.
Empirically. Well, yeah, but let's say for the sake of argument that it was, okay? I'd say that it'd probably be a good idea to look through other solutions other than regulation.
Yeah, but I wouldn't support the legalization of it, which it seems to be what Walt is trying to like imply, that the impossible to regulate something means that we should legalize something, and I would completely disagree with that notion.
Well, I mean, my point is more or less it's just functionally, you know, decriminalized as is. Like as far as the actual operation of the law, right?
Yeah, but
like,
I don't know if it should be functionally decriminalized. I think when something is legalized versus when something is criminalized, I think legalization gives people certain incentives to do things, and I think that criminalization de-incentivizes people to do certain things. So I think based on like that idea, I think if the state is going to be like, you know, it's decriminalized, throw our hands up in the air, I think like that incentivizes people probably to like 3D print guns more. So, and that would like not be within my preferences. So I couldn't say that would be a good idea.
Sure. I guess I'm just interested in your response to like the, you know, kind of the, like let's say that we're going to go around and we are going to criminalize 3D printed guns, right? You have tens of thousands of social media posts of gun owners like who have illegally made these, like sharing them on Facebook or whatever, right? Like, you know, boomers and they don't give a shit, right? And then now it's time to go and enforce, right? And so now you have this like large group of like Second Amendment like nationalists, you know, basically they're religious fundamentalists at the point where like the Constitution is God, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
and
Whatever they should.
they see that getting stepped on, right? Um, how do you deal with like the consequences of that fallout? Like, and
What do you mean?
does that enter your ethical analysis at all? That like basically, right? Like you're gonna have to send like
I don't think politicians should be swayed by literally terrorism when it comes. I'm going to use the Margaret Thatcher line that probably states should not concede to terrorists. Okay, in when their policies are unpopular, the only state that I think the only ability for the state to concede that I believe the state has a moral obligation for is to concede to the people through an electoral system. So the idea that there could be some crazies out there who may initiate terrorist activities because they don't like certain gun regulations, I don't think that would give me an argument to concede that those laws shouldn't be passed, because that would be the state conceding to terrorists, and then the state would set a precedent. Then we could consider all types of crazy things. Are we going to let like pedophiles commit terrorist attacks because like pedophilia is not legal? We could go through. There's so many types of crazy situations that could be borne out by the state being terrified of terrorism, so it like doesn't initiate certain unpopular
right.
policies.
I'm talking about
Okay.
like I'm talking about a real world scenario though. Like I'm talking about something that's actually
Right.
going to
Hold
happen.
on. Can I ask a question, Prag?
Mhm.
Right. So
Sure.
let's say that even let's say that there's a policy that we could attempt to put in place.
Hmm.
But the problem is that putting it into place would, let's say, guaranteed it would cause a revolution to happen, right? And bad consequences to come of that. Would you still be in
Sure.
favor of that, or do you think that sometimes it's okay to cave into terroristic tendencies if the consequences are bad?
Okay, I believe revolution is very different than a small band of people committing terrorist attacks and because
Yeah,
of unpopular
sure.
policies.
I, I think I think a
I don't
revolution is a
believe.
form of terrorism, but sure.
Okay, I don't believe gun restriction in the terms of gun restriction that I want.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, which is largely the gun restriction policy that outlined in the SOCDOM left document. I don't believe that is going to cause a revolution within the United
Sure.
States. I don't believe that has
I'm
the
just trying
potential
to
to happen.
gauge because
Wait,
you tend to make these really large statements like all-encompassingly, but it doesn't seem like they're always applicable. But yeah.
okay, maybe I do the Vosh thing, where I make a very bombastic statement, then sort of build around it. So yeah, so wait. Do you believe it's likely that there's going to be a violent revolution through like some
No, but I wouldn't say that
gun
we should
restriction
never cave
policies?
into possible fallouts
Okay,
of
wait.
policy.
Okay, when I'm talking about terrorism, I'm thinking like QAnon people, or the attack on the Capitol,
I mean, correct me if I'm wrong,
or
violent revolution's probably a form of terrorism, right?
sure. And but when I'm thinking of terrorism, I'm thinking of this very small group of people who commit terrorist attacks, where like probably the majority of the public disagrees with them. When I think of like terrorist attacks, I believe that most Americans are probably. I would say that the biggest majority of Americans, no matter what happens, as long as you guys have a democracy. I believe most Americans would probably prefer to like make changes through the democratic system than through violent action. And there seems to be a lot of evidence that supports my theory on this, because most Americans don't believe that you should engage in violent activity. Most Americans seem to believe that you should sort of change things through the ballot box.
Sure.
Right.
Like I don't think we disagree with that, right? Like I
Mm-hmm.
think that makes sense. And I think that's what we generally would want, right? And I think the
Also, as a
problem
socialist, I'm not a revolutionary socialist anyway, so I'm generally not in favor of revolutions, unless there is no democratic structure in place. But yeah, go
yeah,
ahead.
the problem that I'm bringing up is not necessarily an endorsement of revolution, right? I think it's more that this is just what this group of people is going to do, and it's a very large group of people. It's not like a small
Sure,
handful
but
of
I don't
crazy
believe
gun
the state should
owners.
concede to that. And as long as the majority of the American people don't support it, I don't see why the state would need to concede to that.
Well, like we can start with just like the demographics for law enforcement officers, right? So
Hmm.
like the number of them that won't
Mm-hmm.
capitulate with this at all, right? We can also talk about the small number of ATF agents, even if they doubled in size and maybe pulling off 16,000 arrests a year tops, like not even making a drop in the bucket. We can talk about like what the military, like majority pro Second Amendment, going to be turning a blind eye to this type of stuff. They're not just sitting there playing ball with like whatever regulation gets passed down. Um, like when we see gun control get enforced in the United States, a lot of the time it's on like a racial basis or on like a drug related basis, right? Someone gets popped for drugs, they have a gun on them, they're going to throw the book at that guy. The redneck down the street gets popped with an auto sear inside their Glock or inside their
Well, I'm not a
whatever.
racial. Wait.
I'm
But
I'm
for
not
example,
accusing you of
right?
any of that. I'm not accusing you of any of
No,
that. I'm just trying to provide
it
context.
sounds I'm sorry, that just sounds very woke scoldy. I have to be honest. The idea, well, that for the I don't know.
No,
It just sounds
I'm not
very,
even I'm not trying to woke scold or anything. What I'm saying is they're not going to be enforcing against the target demographic that's going to be perpetrating
yeah,
this.
but that would be a structural problem, I would say, with law enforcement more than a problem with the idea of gun control. So that would be like the problem I guess I have here is that I think people are saying that like
Mm-hmm.
okay, am like calling for like the assault weapons, like the Clinton assault weapons ban, which there is like mixed evidence on if that would work or not. A lot of my things are about like mandatory like waiting times, minimum waiting times for like gun purchases, having like citizen armories. These are generally more of the types of policies that I'm generally advocating for, like the ones that are like described in the Socialism Done Left document. So like I think we have to do more research on things like assault weapons bans. I mean, for example, if one was put in place, I wouldn't oppose it. I would just hope that it's passed when there is some more evidence for it. You know what I mean? But yeah, it's something where if it was passed, I wouldn't be a person out on the street like opposing it. But I don't know if it would be the best form of gun control that the United States could pass.
I think if you were to ask me the best form of gun
Mhm.
control that we could pass, I would say 1000% domestic violence restriction. So like
Yeah,
misdemeanor
well, that's
domestic violence gets treated
I
as
would
a
agree with that.
felony and then excludes you. That would be probably hands down the best thing that we could do. The next best thing that we can do that comes to my head would be expanding programs like Hold My Guns. So that program basically, it kind of sets up the citizen armory idea. The idea is if you have a mental health crisis, if there's a prohibited person in your home and you're not allowed to have a firearm in that home because, say, there's a felon there or someone that got a 5150, they can't be around firearms, right? The idea is you can go put your gun on consignment, possibly for free at a gun shop that has
Mhm.
insurance and everything for it. They're going to hold on to it. And then when that prohibited person's gone or you need to take it to the range or whatever, you can go and basically repeat the transaction and get it back. Keeps the state out of it. Um, and I understand you might not like that. But what it does do is it
Yeah,
gives kind of a self-report for like, hey, I'm feeling suicidal. I can hand someone my gun so I don't shoot myself with it, right? And that's
I'm
huge,
probably yeah. I guess I'm probably the least libertarian-minded person in this VC, so I know
Probably.
like I'm gonna get the most like pushback here.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, so I would probably agree with like all of those except like the where they hold your guns back. I don't disagree with it. I just haven't heard of that idea before, but it does sound like an idea worth exploring.
Yeah, that's a charity,
Mhm.
and I think it's a great mission for a charity.
But I
But
think
yeah,
we're
is that
gonna
going to
do it.
solve the problem by itself? Of course not, right? Like, and
No.
I think we all agree, like, there's going to be multiple things policy wise that happen. Like, if
Mhm.
you just hand out free gun locks with or without a state restriction, we see gun related incidents, stolen guns. Guns used in violence at home, all of that stuff. We see that decrease massively, and that's literally just, hey, would you like a gun lock? Right? Just the state freely provides one. Like gun owners are generally like most people generally act in prudent ways, right? Like, I'm not going to say everybody's rational, but everyone, but most of us generally act in prudent ways. And if we're given the option to like, hey, yeah, this is a security measure I can take. I didn't have it before, now I got it. It's like that's good. So there's lots of
I
things that we can do that aren't like what we're doing in California, where like I have to put like a fin grip on the back of my AR. Like, and I think that's
what
what frustrates most gun owners is like the particularly dumb, obnoxious stuff that doesn't actually make the weapon less lethal. It doesn't actually, it's not demonstrated to do anything effective. And then further, it just makes using the weapon either safely, even for just like recreation or sport, it just makes it more difficult and more cumbersome and people ignore those laws anyway, and it's just like why would we capitulate to that, right? Like why would we like that? So
Mm-hmm.
there's that, and that's one of the big issues with assault weapon bans is that You're worried about not you particularly, but people that are proponents of those bans, right? They'll be really worried about if I have a flash hider on the end of it, or if I have a suppressor. Like you're not going to hear it go off, right?
Well,
Or
I think it's important that probably people hear a gun go off. I actually would probably value that.
and you would with the overwhelming majority of firearms, the overwhelming majority of suppressors or silencers, you absolutely will. It's not like John Wick, right?
And so, but that would still make an argument that the few that are not probably should still be removed.
Yeah, if you wanted to talk about silencing like 22 shorts and saying, hey, you need that tax stamp still for that, like that's going to be a restricted item or whatever. Like, or if you wanted to make the argument like, hey, like I'm sympathetic to like recreational machine guns. So like I'm in the camp of like, hey, let's do a racetrack policy. So you can have a machine gun, but it stays locked up at the range. Or and it's only for like approved ranges that have like safety in case of runaway guns and things like that, whatever, because they can be pretty safe and they can be pretty fun, but we don't need to make them cost prohibitive for people to be able to enjoy your access.
Wait. Bunk, nobody can fucking see you anymore.
Yeah, I know, my light just died.
Okay.
I think
it's dark. Right. Bunk.
Oh yeah, no.
So is stream not up? Oh, okay. Oh, okay.
All right, there we go. I got unplugged probably ages ago, and I just didn't notice it until now. All right, you guys continue.
No.
Yeah, okay, but yeah, I'm for like racetrack machine gun rules. So like just like the analogy that I use here is just like a non-street legal race car. You can still drive it at the racetrack, right? Provided it's a safe facility and they have those measures in place and everything. And I'm like, yeah, with machine gun ownership, why not, right? I can own the machine gun, but
I guess like why to me the evidence on assault weapons is mixed, but philosophically I have no problem with assault weapons on a philosophical level, because it seems to be that there's a lot of evidence that like gun ownership is like a net negative for society. And I think we should probably, so I would obviously be opposed to like recreational machine gun usage, because it seems like that yeah, I mean I haven't done the research on that, but that just seems like, I guess on like on a philosophical level, it seems that doesn't meet my preferences at all, that people should probably like firing machine guns recreationally.
I mean they're fun, but I mean you got to get behind one, but they're a lot of fun.
But the problem is fun. I think there's a lot of things that are fun but can still be like net negatives for like society. And
sure.
I guess like that's my problem, is that one of the arguments I hate that I see, like I know you're probably not part of this, but I do see it, is that I like guns, they're fun when we talk about like gun control measures. And to me, like that's I just have never thought that's a really like strong argument. I feel like that's the fun argument is really based on like intuition.
Oh, I mean, I don't know that I intuit that guns are fun. Like I have a lot of experience with them, and I think I know it like empirically. In my experience, like I have observed that I enjoy them. I agree with like the sentiment, or I can at least recognize the sentiment of what you're saying, because like we're talking about deaths and assaults and things like that, and then like the enjoyment factor, seems to pale in comparison of that. But when we think about it in the sense of a utilitarian analysis, right, that actually becomes really relevant, right? Because if people are getting some enjoyment out of this, and it's literally tens of millions of people doing it, right, and they're enjoying it, and then there's this small like very very small percentage that have negative outcomes,
well, no, that's
that still enters into the weighing here for the utilitarian, right? So like they still have to account for the positive utility and or the utility, your pleasure and your pain, right? They've still got to account for both, and those considerations do enter that analysis, like as just a matter of fact there. So if we're down to use the consequences here as a basis, and we can agree that utilitarianism gives us some tools to do that, right? And this is the time to pull out the 9-iron, right? That's appropriate for hitting that golf ball. Then it's like, well, we do have to kind of factor in the fun factor, even if it's only a little bit, but we have to appropriately weigh that.
Okay, so the empirical evidence is that that, for example, we're generally talking about like civilian household gun ownership. So the empirical evidence seems to suggest that it has extremely large health negatives, has only a few small positive health outcomes, which would be the hunting and the individual target practice, and it has like little to no impact when it comes to democracy, freedom, worker power, minority power. So I think based on that, we can probably conclude that that probably like firearm ownership is probably like, in terms of like household firearm ownership, is probably like a net negative. I think out of that, I think the utility, the fun utility, why there are like some small positives, they don't outweigh like the negatives, unfortunately, of that. And so why even I may be able to acknowledge for a group of people that shooting firearms may be fun. The problem is that I don't think that overrides the very large health like the negative outcomes of civilian firearm ownership in general.
Like, I guess if we wanted to go by the same metrics, would driving cars in the 1950s be comparable?
What do you mean?
So, like, if we were going to go just back in time to the 50s or the 60s, we had higher car accident fatalities. Were they grossly outnumbered? Like, just by sheer percentage alone?
You
like,
need okay. This is a really bad comparison.
No, I mean, I'm just asking. Like, I'm just trying to get to the consistency here, right? Because like, if these things grossly outweigh benefits, then what benefit is it that a car gives that
I can name several.
I mean, sure, right? It's going to get you to work. You're going to have fun with it, right? That's going to be a benefit.
I believe that a car is generally like very essential at the moment for most people's livelihoods. Probably is like a very big factor of why I'm in favor of car ownership. But like cars, if we're talking about like some of the accidents and the environmental negative outcomes, yeah, I would eventually like to see a solution 50, 60, 70 years where we have like car-free cities. But the problem is public transit hasn't been invested enough for that to like really happen yet. Also, I don't believe that cars have the same negative health outcomes or as large. I don't believe that the negative health outcomes of cars are as detrimental to like well-being, to human well-being, as like firearms are.
I mean, I don't know, man. Get hit by a car, getting shot. Like, I don't know which one I pick.
Do you think it's more likely that people are? This is. Oh my goodness. Okay, this is so dumb.
No, I mean, what's the symmetry breaker? Because to me, what I'm seeing, right?
Oh my goodness.
To me, what I'm seeing is special pleading to exclude something from the analysis.
This is so America brained. Okay.
No, Prag, if you were going to make the argument against it, okay, it would probably be that there's a lot of not only economic benefits to having people have a larger area of which they can work in. It gives people autonomy to a large degree. Yeah, obviously livelihoods, you've already mentioned that. But it seems to be integral to having a currently functioning society that we have cars at least available to a vast majority of people. However, if there were no benefits to having cars, right, and they only gave us deaths, you'd probably be okay with banning them.
Sure. But as I've, yeah. And as I point out, like I do acknowledge there are negative like outcomes when it comes to like car ownership. I think they're all benefit, but I think at this point in time, I think the benefits probably outweigh the negatives, which I don't think we can argue the same when it comes to civilian firearm ownership. I don't think we can argue the same way.
And that's going to depend on how you weight it. I mean,
so for example, I think there are always going to be certain exceptions. Like I think, for example, farmers, for example, I don't think farmers can sort of do their job at the moment without being able to like have firearms to be able to shoot down like foxes and pests, and for people who could I think in certain circumstances like that, or maybe like rural people who like live a bunch of like wild animals that could like kill them or their children. I think I could probably argue in that case that like civilian ownership is probably important for them. But I think that widespread civilian gun ownership is like, yeah, I would say that is a net negative. I think there are like even in places with the most strictest gun restrictions in the world, they still give exceptions for things like rural people and shit like that. But I think in terms of society at large, like civilian firearm ownership is a net negative.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, I think on the rural note, I think that and this is a bit of a tangent if you don't mind, but one of the big issues I think with this, right, is that we do have a lot of, I think what like middle America might call like the coastal elites, right, kind of prescribing these laws at a national level or trying to.
I don't care about I don't care about who's prescribing laws. I just care about whether it empirically works or not, and whether there's an empirical basis.
Sure, and I get that. That's why I said this is tangential.
And what I'm saying is the coastal elites argument is generally used for people who are arguing empirical evidence, and the coastal elite criticism is generally used by populists, and populism doesn't generally have much basis in fact.
Like, and okay, I mean, we can go into that, right? But my point here isn't so much about that, right? The idea is simply that there are these people that are disconnected from what daily life is over here, right, in these areas, and they might be really in tune to it in the cities, and the cities may really want like gun control because they see that high density of gun crime occurring there, right? And it can make sense why someone would reasonably want gun control in those areas. Does that make sense? Like, but then when that policy gets extrapolated and pushed out to other places, there's an issue because, like you said, rural people have maybe a different way of life, right? Different circumstances where the use of different firearms and such is warranted, right? As far as like, I wanted to go back to an earlier note from you that's back on topic as far as firearms not being used to credibly like defend people's rights and things like that outside of like obvious self-defense cases. I haven't seen armed protesters get messed with that much in the U.S. What I've seen, protesters? Like armed protesters, like protesters walking around with ARs, AKs, pistols, whatever.
Well, the reason that I get messed with that much, the reason that I get messed with that much is because a lot of those people within the direct periphery, unless they employ like SWAT teams, a lot of them can outgun the police, which would actually reinforce my argument that like the state should have a monopoly on violence. And I think if we have protesters who are out there holding AR-15s, and the state really has to balance the police and that have to think about whether they can actually outgun these protesters at a given time. And so that would sort of, I think, play into a lot of my arguments I've made already.
I think it's a check on police violence that I'm kind of with.
No, I'm sorry. No. I don't believe the check of police violence should be police officers getting shot. I do not believe that should be the check on police violence. I completely disagree with that.
So, like, why is it okay?
It sounds like you're advocating for police officers being shot. That's what it seems like you're advocating for. That it should be okay to shoot police officers. I completely disagree with that.
Wait, Prag, are you not fond of the what do you call it?
Panthers?
The Black Panthers were fucking tankies. No, I do not support the Black Panthers.
Oh, you're gay.
But like even like Black Lives Matter, right? Like like they've had protests protected by people with firearms. Police have avoided them. I do recall like one anecdote, and I think I've only heard of one recently, but where the police opened fire on some people, they returned fire, and then when they wound up going to court, they got off scot-free because the police lit them up for no reason, right? And they returned fire on them. And so like we can go through like the practicality of it, but shouldn't a socialist voice or the people's voice or whatever we want to call it, right? The people speaking truth to power, expressing their rights, getting constantly trampled on. If they need that protection in order to make that narrative, possible to be shared, right? Like what's wrong with that? Right? Okay. Like those people aren't going out there trying to shoot police officers. They're going out there to make sure that they're not being interfered with.
Okay, so there's a couple of, I think, arguments I'd like to make here. I think that it says a lot about the American state that it's got into a position where there are literally shooting fights between the citizenry and the police. I think it says something about the level of systemic racism in the United States and about the level of dysfunction within the United States in terms of the state, that literally black people feel that they have to resort to violent measures because they feel that the police is such a detrimental threat to their well-being and like their right to life. I think that says something about the state sort of failing to sort of respect the rights of those people and to sort of protect the lives of that citizenry. I think in terms of Black Lives Matter, it's a bad situation all around. I think, for example, what happened with Chaz, even if I think that maybe in that circumstance it there was too much dysfunction. I also this is so fucking complex. I think that in an ideal society, ideally, we would want a system where black people weren't being shot by the police, where there
Agreed.
wasn't institutional racism within our systems, and where there wasn't gunfights between. Because it sounds like you're saying at the moment, well, the best thing that we can have here is literally have like firearm protection of protesters. Now, I believe that that's a bad thing. I don't believe that's a good thing. I believe that's a bad thing that now protest movements need. Are you laughing at me, Bunk?
No.
Okay, I'm just seeing their face over there laughing. In terms of I think it's a complete dysfunction of the state, and I think it shows the state like not meeting the obligations that I think a democratic state should like meet. So
Right.
I don't think I don't think it's a good thing. Okay, and so that would, I guess, be like my position on that.
Yeah, if and I want to just kind of take away what I hear as the core of that, and you tell me right or wrong, right?
Mhm.
What I hear as the core of it is I would greatly prefer a world where these guns aren't needed for that kind of thing because people are doing what they're supposed to do. Like that would be a preferable world.
Okay, even more than that, I believe that the state is actually in the moral wrong in that case, because the state is not doing what I think most people have agreed. A lot of people, at least, I think, in terms of democratic theory, has agreed that a democratic state is obligated to do, protect the rights of minorities, make sure that there aren't institutional biases that prevent minorities for engaging in advocacy and in fulfilling, I guess, their preferences. I think these are ideas that most people probably agree that the state should be doing. So the state's for example, if a state fragments, if a state starts to engage in actions where they're not doing what a democratic state is obligated to do, then of course violence is going to break out. Then of course there's going to be dysfunction. Then of course there's going to be like shooting matches between the citizenry and the police. But I would say that's more of a result of the state not meeting their moral obligations. And of course, if a state is not meeting their moral obligations, then I absolutely can see a case for having arms protests. But I would say that the moral condemnation is on the state for not fulfilling the obligations that most people probably agree that the obligation that a democratic state should be fulfilling.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what the Second Amendment advocates are claiming too in that situation, right? They're saying the state has failed in its obligations. We didn't want to take up arms against the state. We don't want there to be violence. I'm begging that we don't have to do this just in order to have our rights as the people be heard. But we are at this point now where shit's gone so tits up.
How come so many countries have been able to protect their civil liberties without the Second Amendment?
Because I don't think it was enshrined in their ethos from the beginning. Right?
But no. But the Second Amendment, in my view, can only be moral in a system where the state isn't functioning and not fulfilling their moral obligations. It's not where a state is functioning. For example, I would say in 2009, 2010, in a lot of other periods in the United States, I don't think you can argue this, right? For example, Norway has a very, very different prison system. I'd argue that Norway, more than the United States, probably meets the obligations of like the democratic like state, right? So a Second Amendment could only be moral, and I'm not arguing for the abolition of the Second Amendment. I've never argued the abolition of the Second Amendment. But the Second Amendment can only be moral in a system where the state isn't fulfilling their obligations. If the state was fulfilling their obligations, I would say that the Second Amendment would probably be immoral.
Yeah, so I mean, like at least the use of it in that sense, right? Because it seems like to me, like the place for the Second Amendment, if the state's doing what it needs to do, right, and that the state is secure, and at this point in time, there's not really action needed from the people to go out and secure themselves in their possessions, their freedom, their liberty, their lives, right? Then like, where should the gun be? It should be in the safe collecting rust, right? I mean, please clean it, but it doesn't really have a place in a society that's super functional and doing what it needs to do, right? But I think like this is where we go full circle back to Bunk's argument from the beginning, which is there is that practical reality right now, right? So like that's what we're facing like as Americans, and so that might be the disconnect, because we see this practical reality at an individual level, and that is, hey, I go to work in a bad neighborhood, or I have to walk home late at night, or I carry money on me, and people see me leave the ATM, and there's those guys that are always eyeing me or whatever, and they follow me. And I can't tell you.
Wait. That's an inconsistency, and I can tell you why it's an inconsistency. Because on the one hand, we are arguing about protection from violence of the state, and on the other hand, we're arguing about protection from violence of individuals. So
But
I consider
why
these
is
two
that?
The
ideas.
state isn't sufficient. It could like put citizens in a situation where violence from individuals becomes a threat that the state is not willing to handle. They both play into each other, and like an incompetent state will have both of these side effects. A state you must protect yourself from, as well as a state that is not protecting you enough.
Yeah, but I think the more moral. I think you can argue that there's a moral thing to be gained in terms of protecting yourself from violence against the state versus protecting yourself that violence that could have inadvertently be caused by the state. I think these two are like very different things.
So I guess like this is my follow-up question, right? Which would be like, why read the Second Amendment as though it's only for the state? Like I
Wasn't it, from what I understand, the Second Amendment wasn't it designed for protection against the state?
So
It was designed for protection against the citizenry.
the literal
Okay.
text of the Second Amendment, right, would be recognizing are necessary for the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Right. So the clause there is necessary for the descriptive clause there in the front, right, is necessary for the security of a free state, right? So like,
I don't believe owning firearms is necessary for the security of a free state.
all right, then you would be against the Second Amendment, right? That's
yeah, I would be against. I would be
Yeah.
against the Second Amendment, but I'm looking at the structure of the Supreme Court right now, and I'm thinking that probably it would be better. It would be better to pass gun restriction measures that probably can still fall within the remit of the Second Amendment, and I think a lot of my policies still at least have a chance. Maybe not always, but I think they have a chance of falling within the remit, I guess if that's the right word, of the Second Amendment, where I think some of the more I don't even know if an assault weapons ban at the moment can even fall within the remit of the Second Amendment at the moment. It did in the 90s because the Supreme Court was very different. But yeah.
Well, okay.
But I disagree that in order to have a free state, you need firearm ownership. I think that's an argument, and most empirical evidence doesn't seem to suggest that idea.
Yeah. So this has been completely detracted from the original argument which I had, Prag, which is the idea that on an individual basis there might be some good in arming yourself when other people are not going to be taking this into consideration. Right? So
What
if
do
you
you mean
live
people
in
are not taking this into consideration?
because a lot of people, okay, it's a reality right now. There's a lot of guns in the United States of America. Can we agree on that?
Yeah, there are a lot of guns in the United States of America, sure. Yeah,
Right.
I
And there's
agree with that.
also areas where there's a lot of crime in the United States of America, correct?
Yep.
Right. So in that situation, on an individual basis, it might be a good idea to arm yourself. In
Okay,
case
wait,
of
I'm gonna nail you down on the might be. I would. So what is how might is? I feel like it's very vague, because
well, obviously there's going to be certain situations where you'd advise against it and certain situations where you might advise for it. For example, right? Let's say that I live in a really rough neighborhood. There's a lot of violent crime, okay? I'm very likely to be victimized, we'll say, in comparison to other places in the United States, right? It might be a good idea. In fact, I would say it would be a good idea to be armed in that situation.
in the situation of
Of those living conditions, yes.
okay, I disagree because I can conceive of a world where it would be moral to arm yourself against the state. I can't conceive of a world where it be moral as a general principle.
It's
to
not a
arm
general
yourself
principle, though. That's why you're like that. I don't know where the disconnect is here. I've emphasized this multiple different times.
Well, but otherwise we would have to say that owning firearms would only be okay on a case by case basis.
I would say it's
In
something
terms
that
of
you ought
defense.
do on a case by case basis. Yes.
Okay, well, I'm thinking that you're thinking.
like even I agree with that, by the way.
I
Like,
think,
yeah, like I don't.
let's say there is someone who is coming out to kill you, but they're threatening to kill you, right? And this person's jumped to your house a few times, but the justice system isn't working. I can see in a case in that circumstance, of where it would be moral to probably own a firearm or some type of weapon in order to protect. If that person owns a firearm, then probably you should own a firearm. I could concede to that. But I can't concede to the thing where there's just a lot of crime in your neighborhood, so you should own a firearm. That would be my problem.
What's the
I don't.
fundamental difference between these two situations where you're getting
Okay.
hung up on
The-
philosophically?
On the first situation, right, you have someone who is directly threatening your life, who is saying they want to kill you, who's saying very threatening letters and phone calls, but maybe the state just doesn't take any action, and they're saying, and they have a firearm, and you've seen them have a firearm when they've came to threaten you before. I can conceive of that situation where it would be moral to own a firearm, but I can't conceive of a situation where you read about crime reports in the newspaper and you hear about crime in your local neighborhood and you decide, okay, I have to have a firearm. I can conceive of the first being moral, but I can't conceive of the second circumstance being moral.
So the reason that somebody threatening you might make it more moral to own a firearm is that the chances, right? So the cost-benefit analysis is going to be different, that you will be
Yep.
harmed. That
Yep.
would also remain true in a place where you are highly likely to be victimized.
Okay, there's a difference though, and okay, now we have to differentiate between another two things. So we have to differentiate between just an overall increase in violent crime and an overall increase in deaths. For example, several people may be victims of like violent crime, but that doesn't mean that people are going to necessarily be victims of murder. Okay, these two things I think we have to like separate them.
We can.
Um,
So the problem is you're literally just going to lead to another hypothetical, and this is just going to pad out the time of the conversation. So you know what I'm talking about in the situation is obviously going to be a place where you're going to be highly likely to be victimized. By that I do mean something that would be either a threat on your life or large bodily harm.
Okay, sure. Okay. I guess the problem I have is that okay. So, gosh, I feel like we keep on going in circles. There are 2 points I want to make here. I think people generally overestimate the threat to their lives. This is something that seems to happen quite a bit. So that's the first point I make. The second point I would make is I can conceive of situations where you could be living in a high crime neighborhood, a violent crime, and where it would not be moral to like own a gun. I think still the tendency, okay, for people to be victims, okay, of crime. Because again, remember, Bunk, for example, I believe in the right to life. Like, that's a really big important principle to me.
Sure.
Okay, we've spoken about this before. How it's like a very big preference of mine. So can't you concede from me? It makes sense that I would still probably find that immoral because of the removal of the right of the potentiality for the removal of the right to life.
Well, there's also potentiality that you might prevent your life being taken as well. The problem is I just don't think it's a true statement that in a majority of cases where people are going to be attempting to defend themselves, they're going to do so accidentally. Like where they're going to like grandma maybe comes into your room late at night and she gets shot. I don't think that's a common scenario by comparison to actual justifiable homicide.
Hold on. Can we please try and use the hypothetical I gave, which was that some guy in a hoodie, okay, comes and asks you for
I don't
directions,
think that
but-
situation is nearly as likely either. Like I think
Really?
the grandma might be an actual more likely scenario. Yes.
Can I give you like a real world one that happened to me?
Sure.
Like,
Go on.
so I'm at the parking lot. I'm in the parking lot of like a Walmart light, right?
Mhm.
It's hella late at night, and I hit the beeper on my car because I forgot where I parked. Right? I'm carrying my Glock. Right?
Yeah.
I have some guy in too many layers of winter clothes when it's not that cold, like standing by my driver's door, like staring at me, right? As I approach. And then he starts to walk up to me. So, like, what's appropriate in that situation, right? Do I pull out the gun? No, right? Do I maybe get my hand on my hoodie, right? So I can clear it real quick, right? Just in case, because this doesn't look good to me. Do I maybe like scan and look around?
Mhm.
Like, yeah, and that's the type of stuff that we train, right? So like, if I don't think anyone here should disagree, and if you do, I'll fight you.
Mhm.
That when you're carrying a gun, you've got to be water off a duck's back, like super cool, calm, collected. You've got to be situationally aware. You have to walk away from conflict if you want to be in the ethical right, like 100% of the time. Like you're going to need to be super careful with how you conduct yourself, right? And concealed carriers in general, like, and this is why I'm a big proponent of licensed concealed carry as opposed to like you know, like I'm kind of indifferent to constitutional carry, but like I really like license because hey, look, the cops know who you are. You know, you've had an extensive background check, like on par with like a secret clearance, right? But the point being, right, is that I'm not just jumping to like, oh, I'm shooting the thing that moves, right? That's something that an untrained person could do. So if you're saying, hey, I want to support firearms training, especially if you're going to carry a gun, because you can't just jump to that. We agree, right? But there's so many shades of gray in that escalation there, right? Like, and even if I was willing to dip into the illegal side of things, and I see this guy and he's like, hey, give me your wallet or give me your keys, right? And I pull up my shirt a little bit more and I brandish and I'm like, hey, not today, buddy. Like, kick rocks, right? Even if that was the situation, to me, that's the use of a gun in self-defense. Right. Now, I understand not everybody sees it that way, but I think that if you use a gun as a deterrent, even without pointing it, I think that should count. Now, the problem is that's difficult to quantify. And so then when we go back to assess that empirical data, we're going to have some issues. But broadly speaking, right, the core of Bunk's argument here is that he's looking at this individual practical view, right? When you're in that situation, you're in that bad
I
neighborhood,
got a big
you know, whatever. And then on your side, I think you're right to be like, wait a second though, but I'm looking broadly, I'm looking at an empirical, you know, at these statistics. Like that's literally the disconnect is that
to me, if we're not engaging in empiricism, I don't know why we'd even have this conversation though.
Well, because you objected to the idea that there might be a certain scenario. So we're literally just like parsing if there's a hypothetical scenario where this might be a good idea to advise. Again, the example I gave, like a friend, you might advise a friend they might carry a firearm. That's a good idea.
Okay, this is probably going to be my autism speaking. Okay, my inability to create emotional bonds with people. Bunk's laugh is because yeah, they know what I'm talking about. Okay. So I think as much as I might care about their friend, I think I also, on like, I guess a very like logical level, would never want my personal feelings for that friend to bias me towards that friend maybe causing harm to others. You know what I mean? That would be my problem.
So let's say your friend is trained in how to use a firearm in self-defense. They're really, really well trained, okay? And let's also say they're in an area where there's a high likelihood that they're going to have to defend themselves, or a higher likelihood, I should say, than on average. Do you think that it might be a permissible or a good thing they could carry a firearm? Do you think that, like, on an individual basis, that might be a good idea?
Sure. I guess I'd have to consider that on an individual basis of high training. That would be a good idea. But here's what I would point to. Right. Here's what I'd point to. That Walt just made a bunch of things where he said when you carry a firearm, you have to be water off a duff's back. You can't engage in conflict. I do not believe that the average person, okay, is that measured and calm. I don't. I don't believe that the average person has the ability to, like, most of the time not engage in conflict. I don't believe the average person has the ability now, sure, I'm cynical about human beings. I've never said anyone otherwise. This is why I can't be a libertarian. Either left-leaning or right-leaning libertarian. But I don't think that people are generally good at that stuff. So I think that we are talking about a very small group of human beings who may be responsible in like those like very specific situations.
Do you remember the way I opened this debate, Prag?
With it's very well. You said very well trained.
No, the way I opened this entire conversation was that if you can make that assessment for yourself, right, on an individual basis, that is.
I don't believe people can make those. I don't believe people are good at making those assessments for themselves.
I said if you can.
And how do we determine can?
No, Prag. That's like me saying, if the temperature in a room is below 32 degrees, the water in there will probably be frozen. You're like, well, what if it's not?
No, it's not. Absolutely, that's a bad comparison.
No, that is exactly the conversation.
You're better than this. You're better than this.
Exactly the interaction we just had. Okay. I said
better than this, Bunk.
If you can, you said, well, what if you can? It's like,
No, but I don't believe. Okay, here's my problem. I don't believe the majority of people can.
I didn't say the majority of people can.
So we're talking about this very minor. We're talking about this like superhuman. Okay.
We're not talking about a superhuman, okay?
I hope I'm not a superhuman. I mean, I think I qualify by that definition. I mean, and I don't know, dude. Like, you know, I'm a fat American that debated Malthy on incest. So
Yeah.
I believe. Okay, yeah.
I mean,
You know.
you know,
And
no,
everyone
I
knows how I feel about that debate.
yeah, but I appreciate you guys, you know, reviewing it. But yeah, as far as I only cared about the first argument. I didn't care about any of the other stuff that I said.
Yeah.
That was just for the format. But
Mhm.
and I'm so indifferent on that topic. Like, you know, if the laws
be
change,
honest,
I'd be like, no one's doing it. But
It's a
anyway.
really crusty topic to discuss. I've done it once. Like
You're
an
the
actual
expert.
debate on it.
You're the incest guy. Okay, buddy.
Once, okay? It was once with a larger YouTuber, okay? They got blown out on the topic, and I never wanted to talk about it again, all right?
But yeah, but yeah, like as far as the thing here, and this is where I'll interject like my kind of, you know, my sympathies for ethics. I'm a virtue ethicist. Like I think that ethics is kind of a matter of deliberation. I'm more sympathetic to ethical realism. I don't know if I'd call myself a realist because I'm a little weird there. I'm still sussing out my own view, but that's, you know, I think like a lot of our problems in society come down to like a lack of individual virtue, like a lack of people taking the proper ethical considerations in their lives, a lack of people like genuinely and honestly deliberating on a lot of stuff. And I think like when it comes to gun ownership, you know, there's a load of alternatives. If you're like, hey, I'm too hot-headed, man, I don't trust myself, or hey, look, you know, like whatever. Like if you want my opinion on the best self-defense tool you could have, it's your feet. The best tool you could buy is probably a flashlight. Because anyone that's going to do 90% of the people that are going to do something bad to you, you shine a bright light in their eyes, they're going to run away like a cockroach. That's been my experience in the army.
Empirical
that's been my
evidence, I think, like outmatched. I think empirical
know?
evidence even like has said that before.
Yeah, flashlights are incredibly effective. And you can, you know, most conflicts are going to be, you know, a push, a shove, someone getting in your face. Most of the stuff you can see a mile away, right? The goal is to avoid all of that. And if you know, so is a gun for everybody? No, but I want to protect the right for people to have it. And I want to protect the right of people to defend themselves, because in this context, it's something that a lot of people do need. And and that's what it comes down to. And there's a lot of people that can meet that requirement. Like we have like 7% of our country's like veterans from the military. You got,
well, okay,
like,
you were telling me a very
there's
this
a
is
whole
going
bunch
to be a
of
hot
people
take. I know this is going to be a hot take. Okay, Bunk, this is going to be a hot take. Okay, so get prepared for this. You were telling me a bunch of veterans. Okay, do you know the highest medical isn't PTSD the highest form of medical condition that like veterans have? You're telling me that we're going to have
why would that disqualify them?
I think someone with PTSD probably should not be owning firearms. I'm just going to put it out there. I think that's a very reasonable.
Why? Why?
So you believe? Okay, so you believe when a PTSD person is going through an episode, it's probably still safe for them to have a firearm on them?
It depends on the nature of their episode. It depends on their individual situation, right?
I can't.
No, I mean for real. I've been to Iraq, my guy. Like I've been around people with PTSD all the time in my life.
Maybe that like shades your views on firearms. I'm just gonna put.
Well, yeah, they're all around us, right? And the crazy stories of like these irresponsible gun owners, like, you know, going crazy, like we don't see those on an everyday basis, and people have concealed firearms around like Bunk and myself all the time here in America, and you never know.
I'm just going to point to you. I'm just going to point that. Okay, so well, over 5 times you have just disagreed with empirical evidence. You just refuse to engage with the empirical evidence. And when I see someone,
what's the empirical? Okay, then let me ask very directly: what's the empirical evidence for people with PTSD being disproportionately unsafe with firearms?
I was talking about your concealed carry position. That's what I was mentioning. That 5 times you have disagreed with me on the empirical evidence about concealed carry, and I think if you're not willing to engage in the concealed, if you're not willing to engage in the empirical evidence,
I mean that's fine. Like I'm literally like, you can pull the statistics from like David Yamane, like the premier like gun sociologist, like PhD, or David Yamane, excuse me. You can go get the statistics from him. Like he's going to make the same exact point that I am. He's like, hey, for how low these numbers are, given this, right? Your empirical evidence is pointing to one correlation, right? But then again, we can also take a look at the macro and see what's going on, right? We can look at this data through any number of perspectives. The question is, why just yours?
Okay, so please say that again because I was reading something.
So yeah, so like I'm talking about like the same argument David Yamani, PhD in sociology, focuses on guns, right? I'm using the same argument that he would use here, which is, hey, look, this stuff's been around you all this time with, yeah, relatively like little problem. There is problems, right? We've talked about those. We agree that they exist. We should take some actions about that. There's no disagreement there, right? Your evidence, though, that you're pointing to is a bivariate correlation between, right, concealed carry states, right? These red states, higher guns, right? We can find all kinds of other correlations with that. Tie them to, okay, in those states where there's more guns, yeah, guns get used more, right? Okay, great. That's what
No,
you have, right?
that's
I'm
not what
zooming
he's
out to the
talking
macro.
about. So I've actually read the papers that he's going to be talking about because I did like some things into it. Essentially, what they did was they took current projections for crime statistics in the given states, and then after they passed concealed carry laws, compared that to the projected statistics, and that's where they got that it was an increased crime rate. You can correct me if I'm wrong, Prag, but I believe that's what I remember.
No,
Well,
yeah,
and you were talking about constitutional carry, correct? Without
concealed carry, it was.
is it
just
concealed carry
overall.
legalized?
Just
Period.
Just conceal carry overall. Conceal carry,
Mhm.
yeah, legalized. Conceal carry overall. That was legal.
Yeah, I'd love to return to it and take a link if you
Mhm.
got it. And I can engage more on that then.
Yeah.
But I'm very cautious about taking just like any one study and then extrapolating out here's all of the policies that need to come from it, right?
Yeah.
And I understand that you also have multiple. So if you want to share however many links you want to DM them to me or whatever, feel free. Like
Mhm.
I'll absolutely
I'll
take
do
the
that
time to read
later.
them.
Yeah.
Because I'm with you. Like I think the empirical evidence has a place. I think that we can understand where guns are. I think that, my skin in the game, as far as like my position with what I'd like to see is I would like to see smarter. I'd like to see more efficient gun control that's smarter and not restricting like petty shit. And I think this is the frustration that most like gun owners in America have is when they see like I said, like the California feature list laws, like, okay, it's not an assault weapon anymore because I put a different grip on the AR-15. Like, that's obviously ridiculous, right? The reason for that, I don't think, is to limit lethality of the AR-15. The reason I think it is so that you can lower the amount of people who are interested in buying them because they look weird. Like, if I had to take a guess at motives, right? That's mind reading on my part, sure. But if I had to take a guess, you know what I mean? So like there's a lot of bad gun control laws that don't do anything. There's some empirically based policies that can be really effective and that we can do in ways that don't hurt people's rights, right? Or don't impact them too severely, right? And we can talk about those and I'm open to those, right? But that's my skin in the game. I think like at the end of it, like we all want a less violent world. I think that we all want, we all want to see people not having to use guns to solve every problem in life, right? And we'd rather have the government like with a functional criminal justice system and meaningful welfare that's actually supporting the people and not just fueling the next Fortune 500, right? But we're not there yet, and so like that individual issue of, hey, look, your individual circumstances seem to dictate this a bit, like yeah, like I'm with that. So
Yeah. Yeah, I don't have much more to add on the subject. I think I've reached my resolution with Prague, which is that there are individual cases where I could recommend that somebody carries a firearm, that would be beneficial to them. Yeah.
I mean, I still disagree with a lot of it, but sure.
I mean, you agreed with me
Well,
on
just
the only thing, the literal only thing you were opposing me on this debate.
no. I agreed with you that are very small circumstances where that may be okay.
Well, if I don't want, okay, Prague, if I don't want it to be implemented into policy, do you think I think it's a widespread thing that some people like?
Yeah, but you didn't.
Of course,
okay,
I'm talking
Bunk,
more
you didn't-
specifically. That's what I literally prefaced the debate with that.
Okay. All right.
I think that's the resolution, right?
Yeah, I guess it is. So if you had said to me, I think in a minority of cases, this could be a good idea, I think I would have probably been like more amicable to your point.
I mean, like you said that, but okay.
I did say
No,
that.
he didn't say in a minority of cases. He didn't. Sorry, they didn't. Sorry.
Well,
They
I
didn't
said
say
in
in a
specific
minority of
cases. Yes, in specific cases, I think we could.
No,
yeah.
Pacific cases and minority of cases. These are two like very different terms, aren't they?
If I were to say majority of cases, I'd say broadly speaking, it's a good thing. But specific normally means a minority of cases. Like most of the time, I feel like if we're talking like in specific scenarios, this might be permissible. You're going to be talking about a minority of cases or a very specific set of cases.
Well, okay. So when you brought up the friend and now I'm the friend hypothetical. I'm thinking that if a friend lives in a violent area, that in like as a general thing, if a friend lived in a certain area, you would recommend they own a firearm, which I wouldn't agree with.
I mean, if they were like, obviously, I wouldn't say like if my friend was unironically like was in a gang, okay, and they plan on like I wouldn't say, oh yeah, no, because they live in the area, that's a sufficient condition for it, right? Obviously, I'd say it's probably necessary, or in like a lot of
if a gang member, yeah.
But I don't think it's sufficient. Like obviously, there are cases where I'd say, yeah, that's probably not a good idea. You probably don't want to do that, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. All right. Gosh. Okay, yeah, it was, but that was because Walt started getting into concealed carry and that, okay? And every time someone brings up a point, I have the tendency to respond to everything, okay?
Yeah.
That's a tendency that I have. And you have that as well, so don't even start with me, buddy.
I don't respond to everything.
Fuck Bunk. Tired of that dumbass loser. Crying in his bedroom while I'm cruising in my cruiser. This dumbass bitch, thinking that he's cool while streaming on Twitch. Call this Vietnam, we're gonna get you on a weight loss program. Everyone knows, you will never be a pro. Well, I'm putting my rap game, always tripping out, never no problems with burnout. The vids keep coming, so does the drama, clearing your notepad, your tweets aging with a granddad. Capital of Chad, doing flips, everyone in the chat.